I'm Jim Rimbach, president of CX Global Media and host of the Customer Service Weekly podcast powered by Kpis, the official podcast of National Customer Service Week, where our purpose is to help you ignite CX celebration all year. Each episode, I meet with senior leaders from top brands as they share their story on how they recognize and lead the people and solutions that help their organizations to deliver a customer experience that separates their organization from others, so you can ignite your own CX celebration. And now, on to the show. Welcome, CX Igniters, and welcome to another incredible episode of the Customer Service Weekly podcast, which is the official podcast of Customer Service Week. But hey, it's not just a week. We carry this spirit all year long with special people like we have on the show today. Colin Crowley, who is the Vice President of Customer Experience with Freshly. He also was sharing with me some important news, but I don't know if he can share that officially yet, which is quite impactful. And maybe he'll weave that into how that affects the customer experience as well. But Colin, welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Oh, now I've given the CX Igniters just a little bit about you, but if you could explain the organization that you work with, the role that you fit, and just to kind of give us some background understanding, I think that'd be helpful.
Sure. Yes, I am the Vice President of Customer Experience for Freshly. I've been in the role for 5 years. Freshly was only founded 5 years ago, so I joined shortly after we moved our headquarters to New York City from Arizona, and there was only one other person in customer support answering phone calls and emails back in Arizona, so things were really interesting. I spent the first year really building up the team there, hiring great people, and instituting all the different types of infrastructure that you need for an organization to perform excellently. So we're talking about everything from policies and procedures to performance evaluation systems to tracking mechanisms for customer data, be it satisfaction or other types of data, and a new training system and a quality assurance program. So all those different components, spent the first year and a half building up. And then since then, it's really been a whirlwind where we branched off where we used to be in New York City. Then we opened up a branch in Arizona, which was our main contact center in the U.S. with a team of quality assurance specialists in New York. And then since then, we branched further where we have a little team in Maryland. And now we have 2 teams abroad in the Philippines. So we're approximately about 220 people now from being that one person plus me 5 years ago. So it's been a real whirlwind of a ride. Freshly, as an organization, we're a healthy prepared meal service. So we're in that FoodTech space, as it's called, which people tend to associate with like Blue Apron or HelloFresh. But we're actually very different from those companies because we're not a meal kit service per se, where you ship ingredients to customers for them to cook meals themselves and you have the experience of cooking. But in our case, all the meals are fully prepared and they're fresh, never frozen. So they're literally like cooked one day and shipped usually overnight in insulated boxes, and you plop them in your refrigerator and you heat them up in the microwave or the oven. And you have these all natural gluten-free meals to add into your lifestyle when you don't have the time to cook, but at the same time are a little bit conscious that you want to eat in a healthier way. So we kind of sit at the nexus of health and convenience, you might say.
Well, and I would dare to say that that particular segment of the industry is just exploding with all kinds of growth. And so much so that, even some of the larger organizations are looking into that space and actually doing some acquisitions of certain brands. So when you started talking about that rapid growth that you've experienced from 5 years ago to today, what do you kind of foresee it happening over the next 5?
Yeah, you're definitely right that there's been huge growth in the field, and you give me a great segue by the acquisition front. Yeah, because the news you were referencing is the fact that as a company, we were recently acquired by Nestle, although we exist as a standalone company, and they were a big investor of ours 3 years ago in our Series C. They were our chief investor, and we worked with them very productively over the years in terms of like science and technology and things of that nature. But we still exist as a standalone company and have the same health principles and so forth. And it's really symptomatic, as you were saying, that there are more companies interested in getting involved in this prepared meal space, but importantly, the prepared meal space in a healthy way. And I think that's what kind of makes our situation unique, where there are a lot of companies or intermediaries you can use to get prepared meals, but there aren't that many companies that ship on a national level, where we're all 48 contiguous states in the U.S., and we're the ones who are producing these meals. So we have high degrees of quality control over the types of meals and the sourcing of ingredients and so forth. And you really don't see another company that is shipping en masse and producing en masse the way that we are in that space. It's definitely, I've seen phenomenal growth since my time at Freshly, where Now we're shipping about 1,100,000 plus meals a week. When I started at Freshly, we were at 20,000 meals a week or something like that 5 years ago. So it's been steady growth, week over week, month over month, year over year. And with the pandemic, of course, and people quarantining, then we have a whole other slew of customers who are open up to our product. And I think it's really taking off for that reason. So it's drawing more attention to the product, but also just naturally as people's lives get busier and busier and busier, which they always seem to get. No matter how much technology we add into the fray to try to streamline some things, life just gets busier and busier, and people are, of course, more and more health conscious. So that real purpose of the organization to fit that person, even who just tangentially wants to eat healthily, because we're not necessarily for someone who is, I'm low carb and I'm low protein. You can be that, but we're also there generally for the average person who just generally aware that they would like to eat healthier. And it doesn't have to necessarily be super low carb or super low calorie or what have you, but they want all natural, and they just want to make sure that what they're putting in their body isn't filled with preservatives and so forth. And that's a growing segment too, where you're not necessarily preaching at people, this is what you should do, but you're giving people the democratic choice to make that decision in a context that really adds value to their lives.
Well, one of the things we don't have choice over when you start talking about the customer experience is making sure that things are working smoothly, when we have a good internal experience and it gets impacted externally, all those types of things. And when you start talking about that type of growth and the projections that you're getting ready to go into, and we talk about Customer Service Week in the spirit, and that being something, yes, we celebrate Customer Service Week. Actually, I'd like to get your thoughts on how you guys have gone through that experience over the past couple of years. But then also, how do you keep that ongoing with this type of growth? Because that can add some kind of frenzy to the work,
yes,
pressure to the work. And you have to make sure that, people are focused and heading in the right direction. Otherwise, we fall apart and burn out.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. And keeping your customer support people engaged is really key. And it's especially a challenge now, of course, where you have so many people working from home. So they've been displaced from their typical environments. And in our case, we've had this challenge for a little bit, because we've been splayed apart as a customer support organization since late 2016. So we've never been in one place per se, except for the first year and a half. And then since then, we've at least been in 2 places, and then we multiplied into 3, and then 4, and now we're at 5. So the question is, how do you get that team of people to feel they're actually a part of a team and they're not these different component parts? And how do you get them to work together? And how can you use that sense of togetherness to instill a greater sense of morale and just general belief in the product and the system? And now that everyone's even working from home, you have a situation where people are even more dispersed. So there's a bunch of things that we've done to try to instill that. I guess it's kind of like Customer Service Appreciation Week every week in some regards, even though that may be kind of cheesy to say, but that's kind of the approach we took. One thing that we bear in mind is the fact that we have to be more mindful about culture-related KPIs for our agents. And just like companies are very mindful about your customers. So when you send them an email, you care if they open it and you care if they click it. And if they have an experience, you survey them a lot to understand how they feel about it. And people don't necessarily, or companies don't necessarily have the same view of employees, even though when you think about it, it should be the same sort of thing. So we were more mindful in saying, let's set key departmental KPIs for us as an organization that we expect to hit. And one of those is in pulse surveying of our employees. So we're doing pulse surveys every single week of our customer service people across a revolving series of 30 plus questions. So we can track the ups and downs and the ebbs and the flows and see what's working, what's not working, and give them an anonymous way to provide constant feedback. And another thing we did is start to open up other KPIs where we hold ourselves accountable to certain engagement rates. So when we send off mass communications across our organization about a new policy or procedure or our weekly newsletters, we track open rates on those, just like you would for customers. And we hold individual leaders of individual units accountable for the open rates for their respective units, because we want people to be engaged. So being much more mindful about KPIs has been one big thing that's been important. And that even including teamwork-related KPIs and agent evaluations. So alongside evaluating agents when it comes to things like, how quickly you're responding to an email, or what your satisfaction score is, or your internal QA score, we also have a rubric, a 5-pillar rubric we use as a company that kind of instills corporate values of how we want you to act as an employee. And every month, agents sit down with their supervisor and have a conversation where they rate each other, or they have to rate themselves on those pillars from 1 to 5 as to whether they're really exemplifying the pillar, and if so, how, or is this an area where they maybe could do a little bit more? And that's been very, very helpful again, not only in a dispersed environment across 5 offices, but especially in the work from home environment to get people really engaged. I would say one other thing that we've done a lot is, like a lot of companies, we've engaged in a lot of different cultural types of initiatives that really get people to blend together a lot. And some of these things are more unique, where it goes beyond like coffee chats and happy hours and things. But we've done things like a challenge, what we call them quarantine videos. And throughout our organization, we have an email that goes out every morning with a memo in it that has key points you need to know in a day. And in the email that delivers that memo, we have a challenge where someone's nominated to do like a little video of their life in quarantine. It's like a 1-minute video. And it's just fascinating to see how people get really into it. So we have people in the Philippines and they're doing these videos on their phones and they're adding music and they're adding special effects. And, you think of like MGM or something. But it's a really great way to get to know everyone and for people to show their creativity and all sorts of things. So things of that nature have been very, very helpful in just adding personality to people. One last thing we do is a commitment pledge. So every quarter, we review all the survey comments that have come in. And as a leadership team, we pledge to handle and address certain of those issues in a very public way. So people know when you're submitting your feedback through these surveys that your feedback's actually being read by someone. We actually do care about it and take it into consideration. Just trying to minimize that gap between leadership and agents on the ground.
Gosh, there's several good nuggets in there. So hey, I want to stop and ask everybody who is actually listening or watching that you share this episode on all of your social platforms. Subscribe on Apple Podcasts, because we get nuggets like this that Colin's sharing all the time. But these are exceptional for today, given where we are, talking about the dispersion and the multi-dispersion, and also talking about dealing with some massive growth. Some of you are dealing with massive growth. Others, maybe not so much. But I think there's good things in there for everyone. So when you start talking about the actual celebration, and you talk beautifully shared with us how you carry it all year. What are some of the interesting things you have done during the week?
Well, during the normal week, there are a few different things we do. And one thing is we do have this newsletter. And the newsletter is important because we really decided that one thing that's hard to combat in the customer support space is the balance between the information someone needs to know as part of like a policy and procedural issues or what have you, because it's constantly, especially as you grow, so much information customer support people need to know. And they're in a situation where they need to be able to take that knowledge and apply it very quickly. So one challenge we had early on was how do we make sure that we have some degree of separation between the sort of informational knowledge that's job related specifically and the cultural types of communications, and making sure that they each have pride of place and just doesn't become this mishmash of noise. And one thing that we do is we decided, let's use our weekly newsletter solely for happiness across the board. So we have policies and procedures where we have to announce certain major changes to our website or some product changes, et cetera. And we have a procedure that we use for that to announce those a la carte as they come along. But we save our newsletter to be like the fountain of happiness every single week. And in that, we have everything from celebrating everyone who's a new hire, to celebrating people's work anniversary, to celebrating the people who've won weekly incentives in our system. I'll talk about that in a second. To including comments from supervisors and leaders who are just really impressed with a certain employee and his or her behavior, to including happy customer comments about agents and what agents contributed to a certain customer's experience. So all that sort of stuff is just wound up in one big ball of happiness and regularly delivered every week. And people know, and they're conscious of the fact that that's what that's for, and they go in there and they get this great midweek boost in their experience. Another thing that I mentioned are incentives. So we've done a lot more to increase our incentives for agents across the board. And we use like a points-based system. So we use a system where if you achieve X, Y, and Z, you get a certain number of points. And I think a lot of companies do that. But the key to how we do it, I would say, is that it's very holistic. So we're not just awarding people for certain things like efficiency-based metrics or KPIs. So we do things like we award the top email performers and phone performers and so on and so forth. But we also make sure that it's very organic and engaging. So we'll do sporadic, off-the-cuff types of awards. So there are times where maybe certain agents have a really bad day because there was a big issue with one of our carriers and 1,000 shipments went missing or something. and all these customers are calling in. And that shift particularly was badly caught up in that because they're the ones in the front lines answering these customer questions. So we make sure that we have the flexibility to say, oh, everyone in that shift gets a certain number of points as a thank you for kind of sticking it through and understanding it was a hard day. Or we have different types of initiatives where we want to focus people in certain areas, like different initiatives on online reputation management that we've done in the past, where we are encouraging agents, hey, if you feel that a customer has a great experience, then please encourage them to leave a review online. Not just to tell us in a survey about your experience, but tell the world that you were happy with your experience. So we've incentivized that. So that kind of keeps it guessing and it keeps it generous. So it's pretty robust how much we give out through that system. And then people can use those points and they can redeem them for gift cards. So we have a gift card marketplace for our friends in the Philippines and people in the US, but they can redeem them for pay time off. They can redeem them for schedule changes and things of that nature. And we're trying to make it as diverse as possible in terms of how they can redeem those points. So that's another thing, which is pretty constant, sometimes on a weekly basis, but could be on a daily basis as a way to recognize people.
Well, and I'm not meaning to separate from the celebration, because I think what you just talked about is very important. But there's also lessons that we can learn, because when you start talking about certain incentives, they could backfire on us, right? It's like, oh, I thought that was going to work out, but it didn't. Is there something that you came across that you're like, oh, let's not do that again?
I would say the main thing that we've learned in the past is it kind of goes back to the holistic concept. That incentives do have to be holistic, because one problem I think is that some companies focus on incentivizing only certain types of behavior. And that can really lead people astray, because if you're only incentivizing, like I've been they shall remain nameless, but I've been at companies in the past who their incentive structure was like, get the sale. And there was no incentive for, oh, by the way, care about customer satisfaction. It was get the sale. And the problem with that is, and then you're creating a perverse incentive for someone just to get the sale, even at the expense of a good customer interaction. So they're interested in getting that customer off the phone as fast as possible so they can get the sale and then they can get some extra payout or something. So the key, I would say two things. The first thing is to make sure that your incentives are holistic. So they're addressing a wide spectrum. So they should address the qualitative types of things like QA and satisfaction-based KPIs, but also, yes, of the efficiency factors, because that's important too, and then other things you may throw in. And the second thing is having certain thresholds. So you can't win an incentive if you are not performing at least a certain minimum level in all these other areas. So if you at least aren't performing at a minimum, or let's say moderate, because minimum is such a sad word, but moderate level in email response time, then you can't win an incentive for satisfaction. Or if you're going to win your incentive for fast email response time, but your satisfaction score is 10% below what the average is for everyone else, then you can't win those points. So that creates people who are more diverse in their thinking and understand that it's not about individual pieces of behavior, but how all those behaviors work together in concert for the better of the customer. And you're incentivizing people in the right way and for the right reasons. And you're training them to be kind of well-rounded people, basically, which are the best people in any organization anyway, who can contribute across the board, and they may be experts in certain things, and they may really excel in satisfaction, or they may really excel in efficiency, but it's not at the expense of everything else.
I can totally understand that. And one of the things, though, I think for me, having a little bit of clarity on would be helpful. You had mentioned something about, supervisors and some of their KPIs when it comes to their team contributions and their team engagement and things along those lines. But one of the things that I often see is that there is something missing in regards to helping to develop, those frontline leaders to be better at it. What are some of the things you guys are doing in order to be able to help them be more successful instead of just giving them an accountability?
Yes, that's a very good point, especially in fast scaling organizations, because you end up with a lot of battlefield promotions, as they're called, right? Where you're just taking someone who used to be a senior agent and you're shoving them into leadership because you need to fill the slot. And you may not necessarily have the mechanisms in place to train that person. So a few different things that we do in that regard. First is we do have an internal leadership program that we do run our leaders through, headed by our senior director of global operations, who has a background in training. So we do have a separate training curriculum that kind of focuses on different leadership skills and mindsets. A second thing we do, and this is especially relevant in this day and age with all the work from home, is we want to make sure that we as leaders are setting good expectations for supervisors And also that we have visibility into the conversations that supervisors are having with agents, which again was one of the challenges in the work from home environment, where we don't necessarily know how is a supervisor addressing a certain issue with an agent. So if an agent is falling down on a certain metric, like their response times or something, is the supervisor using their one-on-one to wag their finger at them and tell them, do better? Or are they using that opportunity to coach the person and really mentor them and help them? And one of the ways around that is we adopted a system called Playbox, and we use these things called coaching cards. And these coaching cards, there are various templates. So there are templates for like one-on-one conversations, like weekly one-on-ones, and then also weekly one-on-one monthly conversations and so forth. But it creates structure around the conversations we expect supervisors to have with agents. So it literally goes through, we want you to answer these questions. Like, you should bring this point up and this point up and this point up. So you should look at how someone did on their efficiency and how someone did on their satisfaction and how someone did on their QA scores. We expect you to fill something in as to what sort of discussion you had with that person. If the person's falling down, we want to hear, like, what did you tell them to try to pick them up and encourage them? So that not only adds structure to the conversation, so it's not like the supervisor can go in and just do whatever they want, but it also provides accountability. So if we see certain patterns of supervisors who aren't very good at filling those out or not being particularly proactive, that's something that as senior leaders, we can look at that and we can say, okay, maybe this person needs a little bit more help in order to have those more nuanced conversations. I would say the last thing is kind of like the cultural stuff I mentioned in terms of incentivizing supervisors, where it's not just about the efficiency scores and so forth, but we also hold them accountable for cultural scores. So that pulse survey I mentioned that we do with agents, we take certain of those questions that are more related to supervisory leadership or areas of the employee's experience that are really in the purview of their direct supervisor primarily. And we take a combined average of that, and we hold supervisors to account for that. And the expectation is, because our various offices can have variations in what the average score is, but the expectation is there would be no more than a 10% divergence downward from the average office score. So if there's more than a 10% divergence, and that indicates something is going on there in this particular group or this particular squad that is not meeting expectations. And then that's the opening salvo to have a conversation with that supervisor and try to dig in and see what's going on there. And that's more of a mentoring coaching opportunity as opposed to the hammer comes down sort of thing.
Well, I mean, just as you've been going through and explaining, your operation, the growth, and what the things that you have in place from a support mechanism, from a measurement perspective, for me, it's very impressive. And I also have a question for you in regards to your title, for example. What we're seeing is some of the changes from, VP of, for example, contact centers or, VP of customer support to now we're seeing, VP director, senior director, all those things of customer experience. How, when you start thinking about your role and looking at some other organizations, does customer experience come into the contact center and or across the enterprise?
I think that the key thing there is really understanding that, of course, customer experience is a broader term than customer support specifically. And that's really the key. So it's really the idea that customer support shouldn't be this isolated unit, which for a long time it has been. In some companies, of course, still is, unfortunately. And I've been in some of those companies, which has been like an isolated unit off to the side. And everything else takes place over here. And you have marketing and product and engineering and people just going about their business, maybe sales, and customer support, like the redheaded stepchild off in the corner. There are different policies and procedures, and you don't really associate with those people. And there's just a lot of bureaucracy and bureaucratic isolation in that. And the whole idea of customer experience is recognizing that you can't really have a holistic customer experience unless you're bringing in the support aspect. So for me, it's really about fusing the customer support world with these other areas that touch on the customer's experience when it comes to like customer engagement. So different types of strategies you have for regularly engaging your customers through transactional emails and what have you. And of course, it also brings in the product experience. So the sort of experience they have with the product, whatever that may be, which in our case is both website and meals, and being more holistic about that. In terms of how that works operationally, and just some good examples in my role as an example, is the customer experience department at Freshly has its hands in a bunch of areas that are outside normal customer support. And more, we have more and more hands in those areas. So as an organization, we chop ourselves up into what we call essential operations, which is like the frontline operations of agents answering phone calls, web chats, emails, etc. Then we have a series of what we call special teams. And these are different teams that have specialty areas of focus, and they're functional leaders of different areas of the customer experience. So an example being that we have a delivery team, which is responsible for handling escalated situations with carriers and dealing with customers with those, but also doing things like reporting on carriers and carrier accuracy. And they run a proactive communication system where they check on the status of packages every afternoon. And if it looks like certain packages won't make it to the customer, we send proactive notifications to the customer to let them know we're on top of it and you may not get your meals. Then they have a similar procedure they run the next morning where they proactively email people who didn't get their meals based on tracking status and proactively offer an accommodation. So they kind of take care of that aspect of the customer experience. And we have an online engagement team, we call it, that handles everything from online reviews, so responding to those, but also online reputation management. So that's owned by them, not marketing. And also they handle social media. So they don't do posting, but they're the ones who do all the responding on social media, or like 90% of the responding or 95% of the responding. So there are a bunch of areas that traditionally in other companies, people would say, oh, that's marketing or that's product or something. But in our world, it's actually in the customer experience space or in my purview. And those individual teams work very closely with partners in logistics in the case of the delivery team. And they work very closely with people in marketing in the case of our online engagement team. And it really helps to create synergies in the organization and exemplify more of what that broad-based customer experience should be, where you don't have silos, but you have people who have good knowledge of the customer because they've been dealing with them the whole time, being able to bring their expertise in areas that in other companies are solely relegated or siloed to people outside of those who actually deal with customers.
Goodness. I mean, a very extensive operation, and I appreciate you sharing all of this detail because what you're saying from a customer-centric perspective is like spot on. It's like boom, boom, boom. You're hitting all the major buckets and areas. And so I have to think to myself is if you were talking about taking this CX spirit, and that you're really focusing in on every single day, what are some specific recommendations that you would give to leaders in order to be able to carry it throughout the year?
Sure. Few things. First, like we've talked about, and I'm hearing more and more from leaders actually, but and a focus on EX as much as CX, and appreciation for, especially as there's more and more technology that comes into play that results in basic issues being deflected. You have a situation where more and more of the issues that customer support people are dealing with are more and more complex because the easy issues are being handled by some bot someplace, which means that there's a higher need for people who are creative problem solvers and very, very empathetic and had just really, really good skill sets in that space in order to be good in the customer support world. You can't have that in customer support unless you have happy people. Because it's very similar to like the world of acting, is that if you're kind of a miserable person, it's very difficult to get up on stage and pretend you're not. And you can't really fake it in customer support because if you have a bad day and a bad experience, then it's very hard for you then to turn that around and try to be an empathetic person who listens to customers all day long. So it's not like you can go into your little hole someplace and you work on coding and no one would ever know. So the EX, I think, is especially central in the CX world because of that reason. So focusing on EX is a huge thing. The second thing I would say is technology provides tons of opportunities in this day and age and a lot of pitfalls too. So you have to be very careful with it. But in terms of using robotic process automation, which in some cases I prefer over AI because it maintains human agency, and it streamlines what is administrative and boring, but again, keeps the human agency involved. But at the very least, RPA and AI technologies provide so many opportunities to streamline how service is delivered and really allow you to reinvest your customer support people in more creative ways. So like one of the reasons that we at Freshly have been able to take our customer support people and move them into more proactive areas like these proactive communications and delivery issues, which substantially benefit the customer experience, is because we've been able to find efficiency in other areas. And not because we just hired massively more and more people, because that's not sustainable. So it's those efficiencies that have allowed us to specialize more customer support agents to the point that now about 30% of our total agent population are specialized in some area. And that opens up so many opportunities in just improving the customer experience in terms of specialized routing and things of that nature as well. I would say one third thing is Channel diversification, I think, is a really big thing now too. And like we're doing more and more at Freshly to try to push messaging as a content channel. So messaging, broadly speaking, meaning Facebook Messenger, text messaging, Apple Business Chat, Google Business Messaging that we want to get involved in as well. But messaging is this really great channel that's come up because it blends the positives of the web chat experience where there's a sense of immediacy, but at the same time, it is much more streamlined and efficient for customer support because it deals with asynchronous messaging. And it doesn't require as fast response times. And it's more convenient for the customer because the customer doesn't have to stare at the screen or stare at their phone, waiting for the agent to respond, and they get bored and they navigate away and they forget the chat's open and then the chat closes and they're frustrated. But they can send a message and go about their business and go to the laundromat or what have you. And they'll get a reply 5 minutes later, but it doesn't take time out of their day to focus on that task. So messaging is really big in terms of opening up a lot of opportunities to find efficiencies in the customer support organization, but in a way that does not provide any diminution of the customer experience at all and just enhances it. So that's another big thing I would recommend to leaders.
Well, and then on the flip side of that, you start looking at some things that maybe we shouldn't focus in on and shouldn't necessarily put a whole lot of effort into. We talk about a lot of the myths and misconceptions associated with, the customer experience and the internal experience. Is there one or two things that kind of stand out where it's like, not really worth it?
Yeah, I would say I would go back to the technology front as one thing. So definitely the misapplication of technology, because that's the negative side of the technology revolution, is that sometimes people see technology as a panacea, and they're way too quick to embrace technology before understanding the value of the conversations they're having with customers. A classic example, of course, that everyone thinks of because everyone has this experience at one point where you try to deal with the chatbot in the company and the chatbot's very frustrating and doesn't understand anything, and it blocks you from being able to get to an agent. And so people know that, but there are even more nuanced things. So like one thing is, we know for a fact that there are certain types of conversations that are highly deflectable, especially during the pre-sales process. So if a customer is asking basic questions about Freshly or our meals or something, we say, oh, well, that's easy. And we've proven that we can deflect those conversations very easily and it appears everything's great. But if you do that and you don't understand the value you're getting from those conversations in a longer term, like, when a customer or a pre-customer, as it were, is chatting with a human being at Freshly, how does it impact how they view the company ultimately? And does that ultimately have reverberations down the line where if they get an opportunity to chat with a human being, they're less likely to have order problems down the line because they've had the opportunity to ask more questions. They know what they're getting into. Or maybe just having the human connection makes them look at the company in a different way and makes them appreciate how customer-centric the company is and so forth. So unless you understand that those may be very deflectable conversations, but you may be getting something out of it where you may find that there's a higher chance that a person who engages with a customer support agent early on is retained longer or spends more money with you. So you really need to make sure you understand what the value is in those conversations before you rush to say, oh, it can be automatable and therefore automate it. And so that's one big challenge I find when it comes to the technology front, just across the board in customer support organizations. The only other things are kind of various replicas of what we've already talked about. Definitely the siloing of customer support is a huge challenge. But even in companies that don't do that, just underutilizing customer support resources. Like, I don't know how many companies, when they want to learn what customers think about something, they'll go through the process of getting these big focus groups or something and spend all this money on focus groups, but they won't even just go and ask someone in customer service or poll customer service agents or sit with customer service agents. So just not using that reservoir of knowledge very effectively, and making customer service people isolated. I would say similarly, getting customer service people involved in things like product and engineering. So we have a program where we have like these liaisons, we call them, where customer service agents every quarter can raise their hand and volunteer to be representatives that can sit in on product and engineering meetings, and they can provide some 2 cents about how a certain product innovation will impact the customer from their experience. So making more use of that in organizations where people aren't using agents in that creative way.
Gosh, again, some Very, very helpful nuggets into really making a difference and becoming more customer centric. And quite frankly, regardless of the size of your organization, regardless of whether you talk about the scale issues or whether you talk about acquisition issues, or I think there's an opportunity for us to learn in a lot of different ways on the things that you've shared. And I just wanted to say thank you very much for doing that. And everybody listening needs to share this episode because of that information. But if you were to provide one piece of advice to a senior leader who's moving up within their organization, to be able to hopefully have all of the wealth and breadth of input that you have, what is a piece of advice that you would give them?
I think one thing that's been key for me is focus on infrastructure early. And that's one of the big areas of success, I would say, at Freshly, that very early on, from prior experiences I had, I wanted to focus on building up infrastructure, not in a way that's constraining. There's always a balance. Where you don't want to constrain an organization and make it into a straitjacket. But there's something about defining the rules of engagement very early on and really going through the process of thinking those through that will benefit you tremendously as you grow the organization. A perfect example is at Freshly, I was there 4 months and I sat down with the first person I hired and say, we need to come up with a quality assurance program. And not something where we just qualitatively listen to a call and say, oh, that was good. But literally come down with a program that has pillars in it, that represent what we value, and let's put yes, no questions under that pillars, and let's make sure we can get a score out of it so we can rate people on it. And we only had like 5 agents at the time. So if we wanted to, we could have spent the next year just casually listening to phone calls and having conversations rather than building up an actual program that had principles and that resulted in a score and so forth. But by doing that early on, not only did it put us in the position of having to think about what we value in our customer experience, because sometimes you really have to think about that because it isn't just necessarily something that comes off the top of your head. So it really made us think about what are the key pillars of a great customer experience for the customers of Freshly. And then by creating the system early, it meant as we were hiring up people, they were coming into the system that was already pre-designed and they were getting the right type of training versus trying to wait till we have 20, 30, 40 people and then trying to impose a structure on top of them. And people already had bad habits or their own way of doing things and where just getting buy-in would be a hard slog. So infrastructure early, even when you think that it's too early for that, I don't think it's really ever too early to build infrastructure and guardrails around which your organization operates.
Colin, I've had a great time with you today. Can you please share with the CX Igniters how they can get in touch with you?
Definitely. Feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn and feel free to send me an email too. I'd love to hear about it. I'm at Colin, Colin at freshly.com. But it's a great pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Colin Crowley, thank you for sharing your knowledge and experiences, and we wish you the very best.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to the Customer Service Weekly podcast. Please rate, review, subscribe, follow, and share the Customer Service Weekly podcast and register for a free membership at customerserviceweekly.org to get the latest updates on how you can help ignite the CX spirit everywhere.